development. Let's make welcome this afternoon Dr. Nkendelim Ihanacho. You can do better than that.
Praise the Lord. Praise the Lord. Children of God, thank you very much for having me. It's indeed an honor and great privilege to have been invited to this Transformation Growth Conference 2024 taking place here. I want to first of all express my profound gratitude to Dr. David Ogbueli, Pastor Shola, and all the great men of God who worked very hard to put together this very exciting event. When I got the call to come here, I looked at my schedule, terribly packed with so many meetings, so many events. My first inkling was, oh my God, I'm so sorry, I don't have the time. It's completely off limits in my schedule. But then, on second thoughts, I reflected. I said, this is indeed an opportunity to contribute to the great and phenomenal work that the Dominion City Church, a church I have immense respect for, starting from my days as an undergraduate here in Nigeria, is doing. I mean, I think this church, Dominion City, has done immensely well in raising great men and leaders, in building society, in molding character, in building ethical businesses, and also in contributing to the growth and development of Nigeria and Africa by extension. I know so many great things this church has done. I've been one of your silent, distant admirers. So I said, well, maybe God has a reason for making me get this invitation at the middle of an incredibly tough period, because I have some very intense programs, meetings lined up back to back, and it's also been a very busy travel period for me. But then on second thoughts, I said, well, I think there is a reason for this, and let me take up that challenge. Now, when I further reflected on the topic, corporate governance, I said, oh my God, why corporate governance? Why am I being thrusted on this scene? And then I reflected again on the person of Dr. David Ogbueli, and then I thought about some of his teachings I had heard about and his vision and how he's actually a lot more interested in building and growing people. I said, well, I think this is an opportunity also and a platform to lend my voice and contribute. Probably you may be able to take away a few words. I've been told I have just an hour. The content and material I have, unfortunately, cannot be exhausted in an hour, but I'll crave the indulgence of the organizers to make the materials available to you after the presentation, so you can look at it and refer back to it and get whatever information you can get for whatever is worth. I think indeed we live in very interesting times, and the growth of the church and the significance of the church has become so high in our corporate, in our physical, in our political lives as Nigerians and as Africans. I think once upon a time, people probably didn't realize how significant the church was. But today, there is nobody that can say the church does not exist. The church is so significant that the church even plays a role in running and determining who will govern Nigeria. It's only in few countries like Nigeria that you begin to hear, okay, is the ticket going to be a Muslim ticket or a Christian ticket or a Christian-Muslim ticket? Children of God, what all these things highlight is the fact that the diversity and the contributions of the church are very well recognized in nation building, in growth, and in development. So as church leaders, we have a disproportionately important role to play not just in governing our institutions, but more importantly, in leading by example. It is the examples we put on the table that would translate into governance of homes. It's the examples we put on the table that will translate into governance of businesses. Indeed, children of God, multi-billion-dollar businesses are also grown in the church. Yes, they are grown in the church. Political leaders are shaped and formed in the church. Business leaders, civil society activists, all of these contributors to shaping society, to putting in place structures for accountability, all play roles and come from the church. So as church leaders, unfortunately, our roles have expanded. Our roles have expanded also into nurturing businesses, building society, setting the context for political leadership, and also ensuring the continuity and the stability of our society. So when I looked at all of this, I said, well, I think corporate governance has now become indeed an important thing we need to pay attention to. It's now important that we pay attention to how our churches are governed, and by extension, how this governance translates into examples that go on to shape business culture, corporate culture, political culture, and climate. Now, moving very quickly, I think Pastor Shola has done a good job of introducing me. I am a teacher. I teach in one of the schools in Lagos called Lagos Business School. It's in Ajah. I teach in the area of strategy and international business. I have worked extensively. I've been teaching now for 15 years. I've attended several programs in Harvard Business School, in the Wharton School, University of Pennsylvania, in Robinson College of Business. I'm a member of the Worldwide Academy of Management. On the Academy of International Business, I sit on the board of the Africa chapter as treasurer. I also teach as a visiting professor in Africa Business School, King Mohammed VI University in Morocco, University of Stellenbosch. I'm an alumnus of KPMG and Zenith, and I have also had the privilege of working extensively internationally for local organizations and governments. So I've had the privilege of working in Ghana, in Kenya, in South Africa, in Tanzania, most recently in the Kingdom of Eswatini, in Lesotho. I've also worked outside of Africa, in Europe and in the United States. One thing I have seen consistently across the board is that the absence of sound governance has actually stood in the way of us building big global businesses. There's always that mentality we have as Africans, yes, that we should have small businesses. Let's do things small. What about that small woman by the corner of the street? What about that small man who is trying to put food on the table for his children? Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, the Chinese proved it. In 20 years, they moved their economy from nearly number 25 to number 2. And they are actively moving to number 1. And you see, God has disproportionately endowed us with human resources, intellect, an enabling environment, resources, everything at our disposal. The lacking piece that has held us back as a people, as a race, as a nation, has been the absence of what? Sound governance. And indeed, I greatly commend the intelligence of the organizers of this conference, and specifically Dr. David Ogbueli, for thinking it important to speak about corporate governance to church leaders. I think it is topical, and I think it is crucially important. If we're able to take this message back to our respective congregations and build our institutions this way, the church can actually serve as the model that will transform society. Do you think we can do it? I think we can. Apologies, I don't have the same level of anointing as Pastor Nee, so I may not be as inspiring as he is. Some of us are a bit boring. Now, can we think of some big organizations that are too big to fail? Let's just look at some of the logos here. I know there are a good number of us that are young, but I can also see some of us in transition who are familiar with some of these big names, both locally and internationally. And these logos. Now, what do all of these logos have in common? Failure. Let's even bring it closer home. The Nigerian banking crisis in 2009. January 2008. Who were the institutions that held sway? Who were the movers and shakers that spoke to Nigeria? These were some of the biggest names we saw. Where are they today? And what happened? What went wrong? Now, children of God, do you think this can also happen in the church? Do you think so? Now, let me also tell you, while some of us may say, well, the church is not a business, the role of the church is expanding. Yes. Some of the biggest financial institutions in the world today are owned by churches. The biggest universities in the world are owned by churches. Harvard University, Oxford University, even Lagos Business School. The biggest institutions in this world are all faith-based institutions. And I also look forward to coming to Dominion City's business school one of these days. I'll be excited to come and visit it. Now, if the church has moved beyond its traditional role and is now playing an expanded role in society, it now becomes important that we should pay attention to the things that made these former grandstanding institutions fail and make sure that these things don't come back to us in the church. Am I communicating? Now, let's move a bit further. Some of the things that lead to corporate governance failures globally and scandals include factors like difference in separation between ownership and control, deliberate, conscious accounting fraud, weak oversight, failure of internal controls, failure of external auditors, weak regulatory environment, and high levels of corruption. Children of God, sometimes we think corruption in Nigeria and corruption in Africa is a public sector thing, right? We always paint government with the brush of corruption. Let me bust your bubble. In the last 10 years, I've had the privilege of working for more than 200 organizations. At least 80% of them are in the private sector. I assure you, without any iota of doubt, that the corruption in private sector in Nigeria is far higher than the corruption we see in public sector. But because, we always have victims and you always want to name a fall guy, there's that sense that the problem always comes from where? Government. Now, let's look at some life cases of churches that ran into crisis of corporate governance. Now, these are churches in the United States. Crystal Cathedral, located in Garden Grove, California, founded by Robert Schuller. Now, this church ran into significant financial crisis, accumulated debts in the excess of $50 million. Factors included costly construction projects, declining donations and contributions. In 2010, the church filed for bankruptcy. Eventually, the Roman Catholic Diocese of the Orange County purchased their property in 2012. Now, there's another church in Akron, Ohio called Cathedral of Tomorrow, founded by Rex Humbert, also had issues from where? Financial struggles arising from ambitious projects, inadequate financial oversight, construction of a giant revolving restaurant, among several other ventures, throwing the resources of the church into crisis. Now, all of this led to a foreclosure and also a filing of bankruptcy of the church in the 1980s. Now, let's bring it back home to Africa. I've decided not to put any Nigerian example there. We have a church in the DRC, Kinshasa, called the Pentecostal Church of Redeemer. Very prominent, had challenges arising from disputes in leadership, succession planning, allegations of financial mismanagement, lack of transparency, infighting among leaders, leading to legal battles and acrobatics over control of the church and its assets. Now, although this church still exists today, the church has a battered reputation. The church has succession crisis, and the church also suffers from severe weakness in the ability to meet their obligations. Also, another church in Harare, Zimbabwe, called Spirit Embassy, the Good News Church, founded by Prophet Hubert Angel, had accusations such as financial impropriety, fraud, embezzlement, etc., leading to also a severe destruction in the reputation of the church, damaged by ongoing legal and financial issues, although the church still exists today. Now, one common thread across that you'll see in all of these cases include lax regulation and supervision, poor corporate governance culture, poor risk management, fraud and insider abuse by management and board members, weak, or what my friend Monica Kalondo will call wounded leadership. Now, when we talk about corporate governance, what essentially is corporate governance? Now, when we hear corporate governance, we may think that corporate governance is essentially about banks, about big corporations, about multinationals, about oil companies. Corporate governance is simple. The manner in which the business and the affairs of a church, of an organization, is governed and run by the management and the leadership of that organization. Simple. How do you run an organization? So corporate governance can happen in a restaurant. It can happen in a carpentry store in Abakbanike. It can happen in a tailoring store in Owani. It can happen in a hospital. It can happen in a school. It can also happen in the church. So all of these organizations that have corporate goals, have objectives, have to be what? Appropriately governed. So what are some of the key issues in corporate governance? Number one, how do you set objectives? What are the key pillars that will define where this organization is going to? Secondly, how do you operate the business of the organization on a day-to-day basis? Thirdly, how do you meet the accountability obligations to stakeholders? Stakeholders who provide the resources, stakeholders who own the entities that run these organizations. How do you present back accountability to them on how the resources they provided have been utilized, have been deployed? How do you operate the organization in a safe and sound manner in compliance to applicable laws and regulations? Now, one thing I want you all to bear in mind, distinguished children of God, is that there are two elements to corporate governance. Right after this conversation on corporate governance, we'll segue into a second conversation on what it actually takes or means to build corporate culture. How do you build a culture? And what are the symptoms of a weak culture? What are the consequences of a weak culture? Now, corporate governance has two elements. The first are what we call the hard elements. You know, the regulations, the rules, the policies, the guidelines, the frameworks, the structures, the processes. Now, you also have the soft elements, which speak to what? Trust, relationship, accountability, culture, behavior, and practices. So all of this fit into defining what governance entails. So governance is not a one-size-fits-all conversation. It's not essentially just about the documents or the hard facts. Now, there are 4 typical pillars of corporate governance we should always keep in mind. Pillar number 1 is accountability. We all as leaders, we all as church administrators, how accountable are we to the resources that are put at our disposal? Whether it is resources contributed by head office, whether it's resources contributed by headquarters, whether it's resources contributed by members, what level of accountability do we have to these resources? What level of fairness do we exhibit in how we treat our members, how we treat minorities, and how we treat underrepresented groups? Transparency. How do we transparently, in a timely and accurate manner, disclose issues of material significance that can actually impact the growth and the health of an organization? And then lastly, independence. Have we put in place the right structures and the right processes that would ensure that incidences of conflict of interest are eliminated, and that there is independence and transparency in how we make decisions? I'll come back to revisit the issue of conflict of interest in a lot more detail. Now, corporate governance typically has parties. You have, in a typical corporate organization, you have shareholders who are the owners of the business, who actually contribute the resources for the business. You have directors who are the guardians of the assets of the organizations. And then you have managers who now have day-to-day responsibility for using the organization's assets and fulfilling the goals and objectives of the organization. Now, is corporate governance relevant to the church? Is it a discussion worth having in the house of God? Or are we not all spirit-filled children of God who are directed and led by the Spirit? Is it important that we put in place structures that even moderate and manage our own behavior? I heard Pastor talk about having an accountability structure and process. And that accountability process is not about God, but having a human being that I can report you to. So is it important? Is it important? Why can't we just say, well, God is looking at all of us, so whether you're doing something good or bad, God sees it all? The reason why we have to ensure that we also put in place the right structures is that we all, as church leaders, like I told you earlier, have roles to play in building, shaping, and forming society. Like I told you, the church is occupying an enlarged role today in society. A role that transcends simply the statutory roles the church used to play in the past. So the church is now occupying a very significant and important position in society. So yes, indeed, I think it's important we talk about governance. Now, failure of corporate governance in the church can result in a few of the factors that I would list out now. Number 1, internal distrust. Now, when transparency and accountability is lacking, sometimes people may not have the courage to come and disclose this to you because of the spiritual position you occupy. But once that lack of trust manifests, what you automatically see is people become what? Distrustful of leadership. Children of God, you can fool some people sometimes. You cannot fool what? You can't fool everybody all the time. So people see through your transparency. People see through your honesty. And people see through your sincerity of purpose. So once these structures are lacking, people become distrustful of leadership. leading to discontent, leading to division within the congregation. You also have things like decreased participation. So the church population begins to what? Deplete. You begin to see less and less of members, or then the church begins to suffer from financial crisis. Financial contributions begin to what? Dwindle. Sometimes, of course, we take the easy and the lazy explanation. The economy is bad. Sometimes it's not the economy. Are you with me, children of God? It's not the economy. It is a manifestation of the governance and the leadership they see. You see people begin to what? Cut back on their givings and on their contributions to the church. Secondly, external perception. Now, this is the most dangerous. I heard one of our pastors here reminding you about trainings on social media marketing, social media brand projection, and social media presence. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, we live in the era of what? Information overload. Sometimes it looks as if things that are happening now are so bad. No, that's not the case. I stand to be corrected. There's nothing happening now that has not happened before in an even bigger magnitude. The main difference between then and now is that we live in an era where information and data travels faster than the speed of what? Light. And then in the world, bad news is very sweet and it travels very fast. When something is good, you don't get to hear about it. But once somebody commits suicide in Meduguri, within 2 minutes, oh boy, hear what happened. I just saw the thing on Instagram, or I saw it on Twitter, I saw it on Facebook. Now, what that means is that your reputation as a church leader, as a man of God, as a woman of God, as a general overseer, as a pastor, as a bishop, your reputation pays your rent. Your reputation is your renewal of your license to operate. Once you lose your reputation, you lose the moral right to guide people. You lose the moral right to stand in the pulpit. You lose the moral right to hold the microphone and speak and minister to people. You lose that right. So, guard your reputation. If you, as a church leader, as the controller of a parish that reports to a region that ultimately reports to the headquarters of the church, is found to have committed financial impropriety or fraud, what you've done is that you've damaged your own reputation. And let me advise you, once you damage your reputation, it's very difficult to recover it. It's like throwing or casting aspersions or allegations of sexual allegation on a man. Once you throw it, what happens? The case moves from the facts to the court of public opinion. Millions of people will start tweeting, it's true, that man, terrible guy. The guy no be amo, no be better person. And let me advise you, children of God, once that kind of stain touches your reputation, sometimes it's almost impossible to what? Wipe it off. So guard your reputation with what? Your life. And make sure that that kind of stain does not touch your reputation. Make sure what? That kind of stain does not touch your reputation. Media scrutiny. There are also multiple allegations of mismanagement or unethical behavior. All of this can attract negative media attention, further damaging the church's reputation. Now, failure of corporate governance can also result in financial mismanagement. So just the same way private sector corporate organizations are required to manage resources, manage costs, and ensure preservation of surpluses that will be reinvested into building people and other areas, misallocation of resources can happen without proper corporate governance. Church funds may be misallocated. So sometimes it's not a case of outright fraud. It's just a case of monies that should have been put into project A being put into what? Project B. Because sufficient thinking hasn't gone into deciding which of these projects stands the best chance of helping the church achieve its mission, vision, and goals. The resources are channeled in the wrong direction. And ultimately, we suffer things like this. Lack of corporate governance can also result in fraud and embezzlement. Yes, there is fraud in the church. Unfortunately so. People come to the house of God and they steal. Very sad, but it happens. So, when we lack internal controls and we don't have mechanisms that carry out regular audits of the church's resources, receipts and expenses, we don't have processes that ensure accountability of the utilization of the resources of the church, you have financial losses. A very distinguished speaker is coming to speak to you all about financial management. He's a lot more competent in this area than myself. So I strongly enjoin you to pay attention when he begins to speak. Now, all of these have what? Significant legal consequences that can result in legal actions against the church and its leaders, fines, penalties, and in some very extreme circumstances, imprisonment. Non-compliance. In some other climes, especially in developed countries in the global north, you have things like churches losing their tax-exempt status, or where regulators come in and begin to ask questions and put more financial pressure on the church from taxes. Sometimes the church can even suffer from legal penalties. At the end of the month, you don't deduct pay as you earn tax from church employee compensations and remit appropriately to the tax authorities. You don't pay your ground rent for your church building premises. Some of these governance failures can lead to lawsuits, can lead to loss of church property, and can also severely damage the reputation of the church. Instability. So failure of corporate governance can also result in high leadership turnover among church leaders, causing instability and severely disrupting church operations. Also, lack of sound corporate governance can affect the ability of the church to put in place sound succession plans. And in the absence of succession plans, the church may actually struggle to find qualified leaders that would lead the church, lead new regions, new parishes of the church, lead new country expansions of the church as the church expands. So think about our great church today, Dominion City. And imagine a situation where this church has parishes in all the 51 states of the United States, all the 184 or 185 countries in the world, thousands of parishes. You would realize that the governance structure you need to run such an incredibly complex organization would be what? Huge. So, another problem with failure of corporate governance is what? Conflict. You begin to have what? Camps. You begin to have what? Divisions in the house of God. You have internal conflicts, power struggles, factions and splits, and you have cases every day. The general overseer is overwhelmed with settling, mundane, and sometimes serious and significant disputes in the church. Now, some of the bigger problems include things like loss of focus. The church loses its core focus and mandate of extending kingdom work on earth. Lose focus of that vision, begin to implement initiatives and activities that do not align with the core values, and then ultimately and most dangerously, the church can actually lose its core focus of impact. At the end of the day, as children of God, our main mission in this world is to what? to keep extending God's kingdom here on earth. So that core focus is a focus we must never what? Miss. Compromised integrity. You come to the church, you begin to hear scandals. And once these scandals crop up, what these scandals do is they hurt the moral authority of the church. They impact the church's credibility. They result in what I call moral disillusionment, where church members become disillusioned and they are asking themselves, what exactly is this church about? How is this church improving my life? How is it improving my business? How is it enhancing the values I bring back to work, to life, to responsibilities, and to roles I occupy? Ineffective programs. So programs are designed and they are not as effective and as excellently organized as this program. You know, you have poorly executed programs, low impact, low member engagement, frustrated members, low engagement, and low participation. Children of God, do we need to actually put in place sound corporate governance in the church? Are we convinced, are we sufficiently convinced that this is something worth considering? Or is this too much of a bother? Now, let me warn you, corporate governance is also hectic, it's stressful. Because sometimes you ask yourself, as a general overseer and as a spiritual leader and head of a church, why should you subject yourself to an accountability of a church council you would set up? Why is it necessary to listen to a chartered accountant, to a project manager, or even a risk manager as we want to embark on projects in the church? When I am the general overseer and I represent the moral, the spiritual, and the overall administrative authority of the church, why should I subject myself to that leadership? Why should I subject myself to that accountability? And why should I sit in a council where I have to present and defend projects that I believe are in the best interest of the church? So it's not a walk in the park. Some of the things I'm going to be telling you now, they may sound nice, but they come with pain. But I assure you, children of God, that if you have the capacity to overcome and manage this pain, the gains far surpass the pains. Think about it. An institution today exists in Nigeria called Zenith Bank. Zenith Bank was established in year 1991 with 20 million naira, which is what some of us here spend on vacation during summer. Just blow off the money and come back. Today, that bank has total asset base in the excess of $20 billion. Higher than Nigeria's total revenue. Competing actively with Nigeria's existing depressed gross domestic product. Nearly 10-15% of our GDP. So what that tells you is that there is an opportunity and there is a potential when we have the right type of governance. And that indeed the church today can become bigger, better, and a lot more impactful. If we have the humility to step down from our high horses and bring in those ideas and perspectives that will enrich our decision making, that will extend our impact, and that would also help us become greater molders and shapers of men and businesses. Now, let's sort of take a deeper dive in. When we put in place this corporate governance structure, some of the things we'll prevent is financial mismanagement. Now, Dominion City today, by the grace of God, is a significantly huge organization. It wasn't like this 23, 24, 25 years ago. Now, what does that mean? That means that this organization needs structures that will prevent what? Mismanagement. This organization needs what? Structures that will ensure what? Accountability and governance. Structures that will prevent what? Fraud. And structures that will ensure that decision making is what? Transparent and that processes are established in a way and manner that prevents us too as individuals from carrying out behaviors that may be counterproductive to the growth of the church. Now, let me tell you something. Nigerians are not more fraudulent than Americans. Do you agree with that? Nigerians are not more fraudulent than Europeans. In fact, let me tell you the truth. Americans are way more fraudulent than Nigerians. Yes. Very fraudulent. Europeans are way more fraudulent than Nigerians. But why is it that whenever you talk about corruption, the first picture that comes to your mind is Africa? Who can tell me why? Absence of what? Institutions. Absence of what? Governance in those institutions. Once you have governance in those institutions, the same Nigerians who behave like mad people here, you see the reverse. I mean, I see it every day. You're boarding a flight in Lagos, you're going to New York. In Moritala Airport, everybody is waiting the warrior. You see people behaving like mad people. Once that plane takes off and lands in JFK Airport, you see the U.S. immigration officer tell everybody, can you please line up? You see everybody at attention. The same Nigerians who are mad in Nigeria, they move into a different context, they become what? Sane. It's as if a special anointing descended on them as the plane was landing. Now, the question is, why are they behaving differently? The same human being, the same 24-hour time period, two different locations. Why? Because if you face the U.S. immigration officer and you don't respond appropriately, you are likely to be deported and put on the next flight back to Lagos. So in fact, when you get there, even if you are sleeping, you clean your face very well and make sure you are very active and awake. How are you, sir? Yes, sir. Good morning, sir. I'm fine, sir. You respond very respectfully. But the same person was telling the immigration, waiting, they worry you. Do you know who I am? Come on, will you give me my passport? Let me get out of this place. You this bagger. The person gets there, begins to say, yes, sir. Okay, sir. I'm with you, sir. Policies, governance, structures, and processes. Once you take away those processes, the same human beings that behave differently will begin to behave like animals. Yes. You're driving in Europe, you beat a traffic light, nobody bothers you. By the time you get home, you get a ticket, a traffic violation ticket. With that traffic violation ticket, you get 2 points in your license. That increases your insurance premium cost. And then you get a warning from the Department of Motor Vehicle, DMV, that tells you that if you get this violation a third time, your license is suspended. So when you see a Nigerian driving in Europe or in England, this is the way their hand will be shaking. Oh boy, match this throttle now, make we waka go fast. Oh boy, no be so here. This place, we have to be calm. You see the person driving like a robot. But when the person comes to Lagos, traffic light, boom. Oh boy, this traffic light was red. Why did you pass? Oh boy, forget that thing. Nothing they happen. In fact, when the police officer or the last man guy or the road safety flags you down, you see the person wind up. Okay, no, say now you break this law. How are you, sir? The man says, yes, my boy, how are you? He gives him 200 naira and drives off. Failure of what? Governance. That is what has created the society we are in. We as human beings, we are products of the governance institutions and processes that we find ourselves in. So even when we as church leaders, as individuals and as human beings are placed in positions where we can mismanage the resources of the church, you realize that in all of us lies angels, lies thieves. But when you put in place those structures, even as the thief in you wants to speak, the structures will what? Moderate that behavior. So sometimes, I'm sorry to say, we are the ones that even tempt people and put people in those situations where they commit those crimes. Because we don't have the right structures that ensure and enforce accountability. We don't put in place the right decision-making checks and balances that prevents people from becoming too powerful and overly unwieldy. We don't have regular audits. We don't put in place financial reports. How many of our parishes complete or prepare annual financial reports every year with proper detailed balance sheets, cash flow statements, profit and loss accounts? How many of us take it seriously to prepare it and see how we are performing period to period as churches? Yes. What are we receiving? How are we utilizing it? How are we growing our assets? How are we building the businesses that should sustain us? And how are we increasing and growing the prosperity of the church as an enterprise? How many of us have the guts and the courage to bring in auditors of repute to come and look into our books? Are you aware that if any of us as churches puts in place governance that is world class, puts in place structures that are world class, even we as churches can begin to attract philanthropic investments and donations from international organizations to help carry out our kingdom work in Nigeria? Yes, we can. With the right type of corporate governance, you can attract those types of investments. But if you don't have the governance, people will be like, you just want to go there and those fraudsters will chop your money. I beg, I don't come out. Yes. But when you have the right governance, you put in place the right reports, there's right accountability, you will see people put in their dollars and their pounds into the kingdom work you're doing in your churches. But when there is no accountability, everything is opaque and not transparent. People will run away with their resources. Nobody wants to make money and be defrauded. So you want to enhance the confidence of donors. You want to enhance the confidence of members. You want to give people the confidence that if they put in ₦1 billion into the church, that money is going to be utilized effectively and judiciously in carrying out kingdom work. You want to give people that level of confidence. I hope I'm not pushing too far. Am I? I'm still on course. Okay, no problem. Thank you, sir. Now, audits. It is important that as churches we put in place structures for carrying out proper internal audits. We should have internal auditors in the church. Yes. Let these internal auditors come and carry out frequent internal audits. Let us have financial policies, processes, and procedures in the church for managing expenses, managing expenditures, and managing church resources and church receipts. Yes, it is very important. Let us also have external auditors that come back to validate what the internal auditors are doing. Let these internal auditors and risk managers flag exceptions. And when these exceptions are flagged, let's have the humility to listen to what they are saying. And let's reflect on them. Even as we build and enhance that culture of governance in our churches. Let us ensure that our meetings have minutes and that these minutes are documented such that when the general overseer comes, he can actually call for a minutes book, observe and read and find out the things that we deliberate on and discuss, the decisions we take, and the accountability around how those decision recommendations are executed period to period. Now, ladies and gentlemen, let me also tell you something interesting. Are you aware that Nigeria is broke? Are you aware? You are aware Nigeria is broke? Are you aware that the tax man is looking for money everywhere? Are you aware that the tax man is seriously thinking about the church? Are you aware of that? Yes, the tax man is seriously thinking about the church and seriously thinking about how to begin to raise revenue from the church. Yes. thinking about how to change the policies, how to change the laws, and how to find the church in violation of its rules and regulations. So, it is also important for us as the church to be what? Ahead of the revenue man. Let us put in place those governance structures on time. Let us ensure we are compliant. The tax man says, pay the taxes of your employees. Pay the taxes, no matter how small or big. Don't argue whether they are stealing the money or they are using it for political campaigns. Pay the taxes. Keep the records in order. Prepare your books. Have your frequent audits. Prepare ahead of time, so that when they come, the governance structures you've put in place will protect you. Am I communicating? Code of conduct. The church should also have code of conduct for its leaders. Now, this code of conduct, yes, we are all guided by heavenly principles. We are all children of God. But we should have documented what? Written code of conduct. That these leaders who manage and oversee resources at various levels of hierarchy in the organization will sign comprehensively to. Let these codes of conduct be properly developed, and let these codes of conduct emphasize honesty, integrity, and ethical behavior. Let's put in place policies that guard against conflict of interest. Children of God, conflict of interest is a situation where your interest as an individual overrides the interest of the church or the organization of the church that you are occupying or overseeing. So you could be the head of the church school, or the head of the church hospital, or the church, or the head of any of the subsidiaries of the church, or you could be a member of the leadership of any of these divisions or subsidiaries in the church. Putting yourself in a position of conflict of interest is a position where your interest as an individual overrides or begins to compete directly with the interests of the church. Now, sometimes you get into this conflict consciously, sometimes you get into this conflict unconsciously or inadvertently. But you must take care to prevent yourself from getting into that conflict. Now, let me give you an example of conflict of interest. You are the head of the construction of a new church building, and all the procurement of cement and granite is done by your wife. All the furniture is supplied by your brother-in-law. All the electrical fittings are supplied by your first cousin. Are you going to be in a position to objectively question and challenge and make sure that the church is getting best value for money in that transaction? If you do that, are you going to be able to get back home? So it's even better to prevent yourself from being in that situation, rather than you get into that situation and then you begin to struggle to get out of that situation. Checks and balances, and then more importantly, succession planning. So a robust structure for corporate governance helps provide the right checks and balances that we as church leaders require to ensure that we are still taking decisions and that we have the guardrails that help filter our decisions and ensure that our decisions are seen to be fair, to be transparent, and to be in the best interest of the church. Mission alignment. So mission alignment is very crucial and very critical. And it can help calibrate and enhance our decision making. Now, another important benefit of corporate governance in the church is risk management. So corporate governance can help the church identify risks. Risks in current projects, potential reputational risks, or problems that are likely to arise in future. Now, the church can also get into financial crisis. Are you aware of that? Operational crisis, strategic crisis, or reputational crisis. Sound corporate governance will help prevent this. Now, there are multiple mitigation strategies that I'll talk about very briefly. Like I told you, I'm going to leave the slides for any of us who is interested in looking at it and, further exploring the content. You also have things like public confidence. Once the governance is strong, the governance is sound and right, people have confidence to continue to support the church. People have confidence to continue to donate and contribute to the church. The church will be in a better position to manage crisis. Okay? I have 10 more minutes. Efficient resource use and then performance monitoring. Better stakeholder management and empowered congregations that have the capacity to solve problems for themselves, empowered congregations who have a sense of what? Ownership. This church belongs to us. We are growing this church. We are putting our resources in extending kingdom work through this church, and we will continue to give to this church till we die. Our children will continue to give. Our children's children will continue to give. That's the spirit you need to foster. It's not only about telling it to the congregations. There's a difference between what you say and what they see. Once you're able to achieve that alignment between what you say and what they see, you have stepped into that realm of building the culture that would sustain and grow and keep the legacy of the church for several generations. Several generations. We also need to ensure that the governance mechanisms we have performance metrics. Have that capacity to report. Now, how can we as churches strengthen governance? I'll speak about this very quickly. I'll give you nuggets that you take back and think about and reflect on very, very strongly.
We'll extend by 15 minutes so
Okay,
you can
sir.
do it.
Okay, sir. Thank you, sir. So, some very important nuggets that would help you as you think about governance. Number one, financial reporting. So, we as church leaders shouldn't take it for granted. We as church leaders are running what? Church enterprises and church businesses. So it is important that we as church leaders are trained on what? Financial reporting. We as the leaders need to understand what revenues are, what costs are, where the losses come from, how to manage financial resources. It is important. So the church should also invest in organizing such trainings for its leaders. Very crucial and very important. And then this training has to extend to financial officers, treasurers of the church. And it's not a case of fearing the treasurer or respecting the treasurer. The treasurer of the church should be accountable to the church council and should have the discipline to report on the affairs of the finances of the church to that council. Once the treasurer becomes so powerful that nobody can talk to the treasurer, then it's time to what? Get a new treasurer. Monthly financial meetings. Every month the church should have a financial statement, detailed financial statement that says, okay, this is our financial position. Receipts, expenses, surplus, potential projects we are looking to do. This is our cash flow. This is our expected budget projection for NEPA bill, for generator, for diesel, for outreach, for this, for that. You must have these financial reports prepared on a monthly basis. And then, for those of us who have bigger churches and bigger congregations, our various parishes must have the discipline to prepare these reports and submit these reports back to head office. And HQ should also put in place audit mechanisms for auditing and ensuring that these reports by the various parishes are accurate. You see, ladies and gentlemen, it's not that HQ is suspecting that you are a thief or that you've stolen the church's money. No, this is standard process of governance globally. You are a bank manager, you are a branch manager. The audit guys must come from headquarters to come and see what you're doing. Nobody is calling you a thief or a saint. It's just what? A standard process. So in the church, we should also build in this type of discipline and culture, and we should have these processes to manage our growth. And to also help us protect our leaders. Because when our leaders also have these structures, they are protected. When someone comes with a request, you know I can't do this now. You know the audit guys are coming. The audit guys will come from HQ by the end of this month. And when they come, how do we account for this? A lot of this audit now will also be supported by technology. So once upon a time, things could happen. Because when the auditor comes, he will pull the church's account statement. And all the inflows that came in, you have to explain how or why the inflows are not matching the outflows. And why the surplus is showing a hole in the performance of the parish. And when the church also finds leaders who have failed in this regard, the church should also have discipline mechanisms so that people know that there are consequences for inappropriately managing the church's resources. So these things are getting more difficult. Once upon a time, all donations were in cash. Today, donations are what? Electronic. So things are a lot more easy now from an audit perspective and difficult from a fraudster's perspective. Minutes of meeting. So the church council should have a properly constituted board. Now, this board could be a governing board or could be an advisory board. But this board should have proper constitution that has composition of clergy, of independents, and of people from other walks of life that bring in fresh perspectives. There should be a church secretary that takes minutes of meeting and documents board and committee meetings. And there should be regular communication through social media channels, notice boards, or other information dissemination platforms through which the church reaches its members or the church reaches the general public. Or, it could be an email newsletter distribution. But it's very important to carry people along, let people actually know what is going on and how decisions are taken. So I've spoken about the need for a code of conduct policy, documented and written, where all the leaders, especially leaders who have responsibility for decision making and for managing the resources of the church, sign and say, yes, I subscribe to this code and I declare that I shall abide by the tenets and the rules and the regulations of this code. Conflict of interest. I also agree that I shall not put myself or allow myself to be put in a position of conflict of interest. If and when that happens, I will disclose and I will recuse myself from that process to protect the integrity of the church and ensure that decision making is in the best interest of the church. The church also needs to have board of directors where members are selected independently. These members play roles in shaping the church, and these boards should have properly detailed meeting cadence requirements, where meetings hold regularly, where there is succession planning, where term limits are defined. And also, this board of directors should also play roles in helping identify leaders and put in place succession plans for the church. Because as the church is growing and as the church is transiting and moving to different higher levels, there have to be processes that help grow the church and support the growth of the church. Training and development. So, organizing trainings and workshops for local church leaders, continuous engagement, attendance of conferences and learning programs, regulatory compliance. So, it is very important for the church to engage legal advisors. Now, while it is good to have legal advisors who are members of the church, it is also important that the church has the right type of legal advisors who have the competence and the expertise to advise the church on legal issues. The church wants to buy land somewhere. you need a proper lawyer who will do search, who will do due diligence and ensure that that asset is an unencumbered asset. You want to make an investment, you get the right type of investment advisor. You want to look at your taxes and manage your taxes, you get a competent tax advisor. You want to manage accounting and finance, the church should invest in getting a highly qualified chartered accountant, building and buying information systems that will ensure management and tracking of the church's finances and resources. Yes, these are valid investments. The church should put in place structures that will ensure that the church has appropriate insurance coverage for its facilities. One of our big churches recently was engulfed by fire. We don't know whether that property is insured or not. These are all the things that corporate governance put in place. If the church had a board, for instance, and the board sat regularly and the board had a finance and risk committee, I'm sure that finance and risk committee would have looked up and put on its agenda the need to comprehensively insure the church properties across the different locations. Pay the premium, put that as a line item expense, and then you rest. When there is a fire, at least there's an insurance cushion that helps reduce any potential losses. So, put in place protocols for safety, even during church events and church activities. Yes, these are all things that corporate governance help you do. Stakeholder engagement. Regular surveys that will help gather feedback from church members, get to know their views and perspectives, their aspirations, their needs, forums. Put in place crisis management plans that would help the church bounce back from any crisis, communication plans. Now, the church must be governed and ruled by a disciplined financial budget. This is June 2024. How many of us have 2024 budgets for our various churches? How many of us have those budgets in place? And how many of us have mechanisms that help us track the performances of those budgets? Expectations for revenues, expectations for collections, expectations for seed offerings. Yes, we have those targets in our minds, but how many of us have those budgets documented? There is a need for that. We must have budgets. We must have reserve funds for running the church and handling unexpected expenses. We must have budgets for specific projects in the church. We must have committees in the board that help drive things like strategic fundraising, that help execute special projects in the church. We need to have stewardship programs that help, so in the academic environment, we call it advancement, that help educate people and teach them how to manage stewardship and manage charitable giving. We have mission adherence. We have strategic planning that help in program evaluation, help in driving the execution of various strategic initiatives in the church. Now, another thing the church also needs is inclusive governance. So yes, while we are clones as human beings and we always like people that are like us, that tell us only what we want to hear, one of the things governance also recommends is having people that tell you things you don't want to hear. Also ensure that your boards are diverse enough to have what we call the lone voice in the wilderness. People who radically think very differently. They help ground truth and validate any facts or any risks you will be about to take. Because you see, ladies and gentlemen, there is that tendency that as church leaders who are also spirit-filled, we may consider ourselves as humans that are beyond reproach. But when we have these mechanisms, they help strengthen our decision-making. They help us, that process of even convincing one of your board members as to why the church should take this decision or carry out this investment will help you take a better decision. Some of those questions he or she will ask as you go through that decision-making process will help guide you on landmines you could have fallen into if you didn't have that perspective. So sometimes don't just look at those voices as critical voices. Look at those voices as checks that help to strengthen your decision-making. I mean, I've had the privilege of sitting on boards for more than 10 years. And I mean, I've seen the good, the bad, the ugly. Sometimes I've also seen boards seemingly slow things down. But overall, one thing I can tell you is that corporate governance pays. It helps to build large organizations, and it is indeed a crucial requirement if we want our churches to become global, become international, have subsidiaries, and more importantly, extend our work and our impact as children of God who are in that business of winning souls and extending the kingdom of God on earth. Now, the last thing I want to tell you about before we leave is the Nigerian Code of Corporate Governance. So I'll just move quickly to that slide. Like I told you, you're going to have all the slides if you're interested. Okay, I don't know. My technology is not moving. Okay, it has woken up. Okay. All of this, I've spoken about all of this in detail. So I'll just go and show you. So now, your board should typically have committees like audit and finance, risk management, remuneration, personnel and governance. Now, you may also have committees like strategy. So committees are subsets of your main board that would help look into specific areas that you consider critical and crucial for the growth of the church and for the growth of the accompanying businesses that the church is undertaking. Now, as leaders, our responsibilities are large. We have what I call a special role to play in unfolding and creation. Our roles go beyond just running the business of the church and keeping the doors open and closed. We have roles in shaping organizations, and we have roles in shaping and creating the future of contemporary society. The church is under attack. Society is under attack. So if we as church leaders don't wear that helm of leadership, it becomes difficult for us to create the leaders of society that would solve the problems that have held us hostage as Nigerians and by extension Africans. So we need to realize that as leaders, we have an awesome responsibility to our vocation of leadership. Now, on a final note, the Nigerian Code of Corporate Governance requires us as churches who are not for profit to adhere to the following. I know some of these things may sound very strange to you, and you'll be wondering, do regulations like this exist? Yes, they do. They do. And they are entwined. So we as churches are required to have a board, structure, composition. These boards are supposed to have committees and roles. We are supposed to have clear separation between leadership and management. We should have appraisals for our pastors and for our church leaders and for our regional heads, where we actually appraise their performance. And the appraisal should not only be about revenue generation or collections. The appraisal should also be total, looking at how they are helping us achieve the missions and the visions of our respective churches. The Nigerian Code of Corporate Governance also requires that we put in place ethical standards like code of conduct, policies such as conflict of interest. The Code of Corporate Governance requires that we have financial management and transparency processes, and that we must carry out and prepare frequent financial reports. We must carry out audits, and we must ensure transparency. This same NCCG requires that we as churches must have what we call risk management frameworks that help us identify risks, mitigate these risks. We as churches must also have clear stakeholder engagement plans that help us manage legal and regulatory compliance. We must also have strategic plans. What's the strategic plan for your church? Is there a need to have a strategic plan? Yes, you need to have a strategic plan. A strategic plan is not only for a business, a church needs a strategic plan that clearly shows how we're going to move from where we are to where we want to be. What are our goals, what are our objectives, and how are we going to achieve those goals and objectives in the context of our society, in the context of the level of education and the resources available to our members in our various locations. We must think along these lines. Legal and regulatory compliance, board and staff development. So it's not enough to develop your staff, you must also develop your board. Train them regularly and expose them. We must also put in place performance monitoring and evaluation. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. I think that comes and brings a close to our first session. I hope it wasn't too boring.
Boring at all. Everybody tell him thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you.
Wow.
Thank you, sir. So, how long before the next session? The next session. Okay, sir.
Gentlemen, the next session is going to be happening by 5 p.m. So we're going to give you a long break now because he's going back to Lagos today, this night. So actually that session should have happened this afternoon. So it's going to be happening by 5 p.m. So once you go, get a good rest and return back so that you'll be able to. And you know, these things are very critical.